Why would a small innovative company be banned from pro play?
Imagine if every time the tires on your car wore out, you would have to buy a new car. Sounds kind of ridiculous, right? Believe it or not, that's what we're having to do with pickleball paddles right now.
A lot of people don't realize how fast paddles wear out.
So get this, a research study was done on paddle surface grit, and what they did was they measured the performance of your paddle surface grit after a certain amount of play. What they came to find out is
one of the key functions of that product wears out in 50 hours of play or less. People sometimes ask, who haven't seen it before, how long does it take? So we don't really need a timer, but this is me taking off a sheet, and this is me putting a sheet back on. Most of the big paddle companies have directly come to us to discuss licensing. If the strings wear out on a tennis racket or they break, you don't swap the tennis racket. You swap the strings, which will allow a better performance, better value, higher sustainability.
This is Nick, the founder of Reload, who founded and patented these replaceable paddle surfaces. Stick around for the end as Nick hints at some new products and I give my post-interview reaction and thoughts. So my guest today is a director, producer, and the co-founder for Reload, and he also had various different jobs as well, a career in the tech space as well. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, Brian.
How's that intro?
It's good.
All
it's
right.
Good, yeah. It's a 1 hour interview. We'll spend 10 minutes on the intro and then like 5 minutes on everything. No, it's good. It's fine.
Context is important.
Yes.
Tell me about your life. Let's say, date me back 10 years ago.
Oof. I mean, when you're a serial entrepreneur, you end up thinking years are basically which startup were you on at that time. But in this case, I think I understand what you're getting at. So the most recent startup prior to Reload, I think, 10 years ago was about 2 startups ago. I was working at the time in a lot of virtual reality and augmented reality projects. I say projects because for most entrepreneurs, there is a set of phases in any idea that they have. It starts out as maybe a problem that they try to solve, and then it'll change into an idea that maybe they have about how to solve that problem. Then they might try and get some money. Then they might try and get a partner. And then eventually when they get some money, they got to build the bloody thing. So I think my experiences in augmented reality and virtual reality were fascinating because I think for a lot of us that were in that space, we're a little bit ahead of our time. There was great things that you could build, but at the end of the day, who wanted to have a giant hunk of plastic on their heads and go, wow, that's cool, I'm underwater swimming with a whale? It was fascinating as a tech demo. The question was it actually a solution to a problem, or was it a solution in search of a problem? And unfortunately, I feel that early on, the consumer VR and AR stuff that I was working on was a solution in search of a problem. But to fast forward the story of the last 10 years, I did end up discovering and partnering with a couple of individuals to found a company that actually used those techniques and many of the ideas that we developed at the time to solve a real problem. And in this case, the company became Red6, and the solution was an augmented reality training system for warfighters, specifically fighter pilots initially. The idea was a new kind of drop-in visor, which would integrate with the visor of a fighter pilot helmet. So a pilot could fly around. It's not a ground simulator. They could fly around and look up and see enemy aircraft that weren't actually there, essentially play video games in the sky. That means all of that sort of stuff that you see in Top Gun, instead of having multiple aircraft flying against each other physically, which is very expensive and relatively dangerous, you could do unlimited amounts of training over and over again in an augmented reality environment. So yeah, that's what I built. And then after that, it's been a fascinating environment trying to figure out what things one can do in pickleball that are both interesting, i.e. an interesting problem to solve, but also valuable. And I don't mean just valuable in terms of dollars. I mean, yes, sure. At the end of the day, if you're going to invest your own time and your own money and investors' money, there's got to be at least a chance of extracting dollar value, because otherwise you're not going to do it. I mean, maybe if you have a lot of money and a lot of time, you will. But yeah, that's sorry I gave you like 20 answers there, but the I can stop or I can keep going, whatever you want.
No, it's awesome. I mean, I was just going to ask, you hear this every once in a while of people who come from very interesting backgrounds. Considering the work you did, I would say that's pretty extraordinary. And how the heck did you end up in pickleball of all things?
So it's for me, the journey to pickleball, based on a lot of people that I've spoken to, is a little bit similar to others in the sense that they hated it at the beginning, or maybe hated is too strong a word. They looked down on it. So I know for me, about a little over 2 years ago, and this is coming from someone, I think I started playing tennis when I was 5. I played tennis a lot in my teens. I did like local club competitions. I had a decent racket sports background. My main sport growing up was basketball. I did a lot of martial arts, but basketball was the one that I trained in, competed in, played at national level, played at international level. And with racket sports, I loved tennis growing up. And I then rediscovered my love for tennis about 4 years ago and started playing again, started getting hooked up with a couple of coaches, started thinking, wow, this is actually kind of cool. I loved all the technical aspects. I love the competitive aspects. And when someone mentioned pickleball, I just thought, this is for old people. Look at this. It's so noisy. What a stupid name. I don't want to do this. Why would I even try this? So when I tell you that I got into pickleball and I got hooked on it right away, which is the bit that's in common with a lot of people, I want to make it clear that I was not coming from zero. I was not coming going, hey, I'll try anything once. Let's try it. I was coming from a hard no. No, I'm never going to do this thing. No, this is stupid. No, I don't want to do it. And as it happens, this little sport that we're all addicted to in one way or another, it did its magic. There was something about it. I mean, I'll give you one quick specific personal example. When playing tennis with people who don't have a high level of experience in racket sports is a pain in the ass. They can't serve. The ground strokes mechanics are incredibly complicated. And if you can do all of those things, it's not that it's impossible to be on the same court as a lower level player. It's no fun. It's no fun for either entity. Whereas pickleball does something amazing where it compresses the skill levels into a way that someone who's got a lot of racket sports experience and coordination can still enjoy themselves, even if they're playing with a lower level player. And that, plus the age dynamics, the fact that older and younger players can play, the fact that it focuses massively on doubles and there's a social component to it, there were so many boxes that were ticked that were fascinating for me, and that made it so that, again, even though I entered pickleball going, this is going to suck, within 48 hours, it became very clear to me that this was something that I could see myself playing every day for as long as I live.
Yeah.
But the question you actually asked was, how did I get into pickleball from a business perspective? Like, what caused me to do this?
Yeah, like why solve this problem versus problems that you were already solving that arguably you could have found more value, right? Like, there's not a ton of value in solving problems in a sport like pickleball, not just on the paddle side. It could be something like apparel, it could be the other things versus, like you were telling stories and documentaries of conflict zones. You were doing AR and VR for, fighter pilots who, arguably that's more valuable,
No, it's an interesting question because there are different ways in which one can think of value. It can be a personal perspective, a social perspective, what makes you happy for the sake of argument, what makes you feel good, and of course, where the dollars are. One of the things that's for example, in the early virtual reality and augmented reality days, when I was working on the consumer side, it was quite difficult because there just wasn't enough of an installed base. As exciting as it is to see things like Magic Leap and the products that Apple might produce or the Microsoft HoloLens, the problem is there isn't enough people. It doesn't impact enough people, whatever you do. So in a way, it's a form of intellectual masturbation. Like, yeah, sure, you can come up with a solution, but if 5.5 people are going to benefit from that solution, why are you doing it? Even if someone does pay you a lot of money to do it. But as far as the DoD stuff was concerned, Department of Defense, the military stuff, one of the things that's frustrating as a creator or an inventor in that space is the timelines. So, for example, you decide to build something, you come up with an idea, and then maybe, if you're successful 4 years after that point, the idea might actually be deployed in some way that might benefit the warfighter and or someone organizationally. So while there's a significant amount of value in the broader sense of the word, it takes a hell of a long time. I got a bunch of friends in the film industry who are super frustrated because, for example, they might work on Avatar 2 or Avatar 3, and you think, wow, that's an amazing movie. It's a blockbuster. It changes the dynamics of everything. Huge amounts of money are involved. Yeah, but it takes 10 years to make the thing. So whereas you might work on a smaller budget project and you get the thing wrapped up in 6 to 9 months, and then you can work on something else and you can keep on learning and moving on. So from my perspective, I had never worked in a consumer hard goods product. I'd never worked in a piece of sporting equipment. And yes, from a technical perspective, what I'd been working on in the past was a combination of low latency air-to-air encrypted communication and complicated optical stacks in order to enable augmented reality in the eye. So from that perspective, if you compare it to a pickleball paddle is like putting peanut butter on a sandwich. However, there's an interesting amount of complexity and subtlety and touch. So when you change layers of the way in which a pickleball paddle is constructed, we've all felt it when we pick up 2 or 3 different paddles, which are made with more or less the same materials and more or less in the same way, often in the same factory. Yet, if I hand them to you, you'll be like, well, this one's different. I prefer this one. This isn't quite right. This one feels a little off balance. These are tiny differences, and people are quite, some of it is fashion, some of it is habit, some of it is perhaps a specific subtlety that you actually feel. But overall, it's been a really interesting challenge because what is actually relatively technically simple to build, getting it right, getting it to be something that truly delights people when they use it, that's fascinating. On top of that, building a consumer brand, that's an interesting challenge. That's something I hadn't done before.
Yeah, that's great. When you say like delighting people, that was something I always picked up in UX, and that was commonly said, like the experience, a user's experience with any product, whether it's digital or physical, delighting people is always like I don't know if it's like a North Star thing, but it is something to be achieved in some regards, depending on the product. But that's like Apple, from opening the box to using the product. It's a delightful experience, but that's very interesting.
I think it's what you said is it's easy to say, like you said it, but actually doing it and what it means, that those endorphin rushes that a lot of people, if you ask an engineer, they might miss those bits, because a pure engineer is focused on solving a pure technical problem. How do you get widget A to connect to widget B in a certain way? But the consumer doesn't care about the widgets connecting or how. The consumer cares about something that's tough to capture. It could be the way it makes them feel when they wear it, or the way it makes them feel when they tell their friends about it. It's a complicated mix of dollar value, ego, tribal signaling. All kinds of things are intermixed in there. And yes, when you're making a B2B solution, for example, I don't know, something for power stations that makes the energy loss due to the cables heating up more efficient, you don't have to worry about the consumer delight things anywhere near as much. There still is a customer, but they don't think about it that way. It's just dollars and cents. But when you're making something that people touch, and moreover that they hit balls with on a regular basis, all of the above is vital, because if there are 1,000 ways of getting it wrong and very few ways of getting it right.
Yeah. Well, man, tell me about Reload. Tell me about like how you came to the idea, where the company is now, everything that happened in between, when it started and where it is now, and like how it's going.
Sure. So it's a really nice segue to talk about Reload, because go back to the story I mentioned, which is that I'm entering this pickleball court going, this is going to suck, but I'm doing it anyway because people are dragging me, kicking and screaming to this thing. And I kind of find myself going, this is actually really interesting. I kind of like this thing. And I don't immediately go, while I would definitely describe myself as a serial entrepreneur, it's not like I'm going around like a hungry dog looking for some food. I'm just constantly, my mind is open to ideas and problems that I may or may not be interested in. And to illustrate the idea with Reload, I'll give you an example of something that I wouldn't do. I don't know, this is a silly story, but for example, I'm sure all of us have experienced going to a restaurant and going, oh, where's the salt shaker? And then you grab the salt shaker and you kind of shake it and nothing comes out. And then you look at the salt shaker and you go, well, there's still loads of salt in it. Why isn't it coming out? And yes, for sure, in an engineer's mind, you might go, there's salt in the salt shaker. It's not coming out because it's jammed, but it's moving. Why is it jammed? Oh, because the lid of it has somehow congealed. Maybe it's, I don't know, moisture. Maybe it's dirty. Who knows? And some part of an engineer mindset or an entrepreneur will fast forward and go, do I know why this is happening? Can I fix this? But the realities should set in if you can keep yourself in check as an entrepreneur. And they should go, hang on, do I really care about solving this problem? Do I really care about re-engineering a new type of lid on salt? I mean, yeah, loads of people have this problem. Okay, how much do I give a shit? Is it an interesting enough problem to solve? Is there money to be made here? And usually, before you know it, you might just go, fuck it, I'm grabbing another salt shaker and that one works fine. So it is not enough, for me at least, maybe it is for some others, it's not enough for me to go, I have a problem, I want to solve it. It needs to be multiple different things that line up in order for me to care. It needs to be, I have a problem, I have an idea how I might solve it, there might be money in this, and on top of that, this is not just my personal problem, this is a broad problem that affects a lot of people. If I can line up multiple things like that, then it might be an idea worth pursuing. But somewhere in there, it also, for me at least, it has to be interesting. Because if it's not interesting, then I'll just go do something else. So much like, when an investor thinks about investing in an idea, they more or less they'll have a certain element of thesis, like someone might only invest in biotech and someone else might only invest in crypto. But they will always be thinking about ROI because it's their job, return on investment. If I put dollars into this, can I get dollars out at some multiple? But as an entrepreneur, we are all compelled to think that way also, except we're not thinking with dollars, we're thinking with time. Fine, dollars also, but time is the principal currency. We don't have an infinite amount of time. Not every idea is worth pursuing. So the big thing for me is, do I want the pain of the next 2 to 5 years before there's a meaningful event? One would hope, if you do it successfully, the pain that's going to be required, the time commitment and the passion this is going to take. So to answer the question about how it happened with pickleball, for me it was relatively straightforward. I started taking it more seriously and thinking, wow, I actually want to play this. And it didn't take long, especially given a significant tennis background, that to go, why does this feel so horrible? This particular paddle feels so horrible. So I started going, I want to find a paddle that feels good. And I did. And eventually found a paddle that felt good and cost $250. And I thought, wow, now I've got a decent paddle that I really enjoy playing with. Now, I'll show you something as a quick demo. This is not the paddle that I bought, but it doesn't really matter. It'll serve to illustrate the point. I noticed that I happened to have a torn meniscus at the time. I had just had it repaired, so I couldn't run a lot. And because I couldn't run a lot, what I could do was I could serve a lot. And it's an important part of the story because when serving, it's a repetitive motion over and over again. And if you have sufficient experience, you can tell what's happening to the paddle when you're doing this all the time. And I noticed after about 2 or 3 weeks of just doing serve practice or ground stroke practice every day, I noticed that the paddle was not catching. It was not catching. I couldn't catch as much topspin as I could at the very beginning. So I thought, that's weird. But again, this is not yet the eureka moment. This is not when I go, oh yeah, let's make Reload. This is when I go, that's weird. Let's grab the other salt shaker, if you wish, to go back to the other story. So I contacted the company that made the paddle and I said, hey guys, something's wrong. It doesn't really work. Like it's all worn out. And they said, yeah, sure, here's another one. Okay, so the second one arrives, and same thing happens. Another 2 weeks go by, and it's gone again. So I contact them again, and I go, I don't know if it's a bad batch, but it's worn out. It's only been 2 weeks. What's going on? And they go, yeah, that's just how it is. So I say, well, what does that mean? And what am I supposed to do? And they go, you're supposed to just buy another one. And I go, hang on. It costs $250. So you can probably take a guess as to which one it was. But, we'll be nice and not name any names. Because to be honest, even if we name names, it wouldn't matter. Because the punchline is they all have the same problem. The bottom line was that I was told, look, replacement paddles aren't covered under warranty. So I was a little frustrated. And that's when the itch starts. So I'm a little frustrated. I've got a problem because I paid $250 for an item that wore out within 2 weeks of me, not fully worn out. Make no mistake, when all of us, whether it's on this podcast or on others, talk about paddles wearing out or the grit on paddles wearing out, it doesn't mean it wears out to zero. It's not like the paddles disappear, but it wears out noticeably. And I just kind of thought, I'm like, wait a second. If the tires wore out on my car and somebody said, oh yeah, they're worn out, you should go buy a new car, you'd be like, what are you talking about? No, swap the tires. And likewise, if strings, if you want a more close analog, if strings wear out on a tennis racket or they break, you don't swap the tennis racket, you swap the strings. So I started thinking, hang on a second, these balls, and this is where the experience, lots of work with composite materials in prior startups comes. These balls have sharp-edged holes, and those holes are likely tearing up the surface of the paddle. That cannot be fixed very easily because you've got a hard plastic object hitting another hard plastic object. So I took a look at this and I thought, wow, this stuff really is wearing out really fast. I started talking to more people, and the higher level the player, the more they confirmed this was happening. I started talking to pros, and pros would go, yeah, we'd swap a paddle every day if we could. If we have enough, we'll happily swap it every day. And for some brands, it was even more frequent than that. I mean, I think we all know that painted on grit is horrendous. It just gets ripped off right away. And this stuff, I mean, NASA and the DoD spent a significant, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars inventing carbon fiber because they needed this stuff to be super, super tough and lightweight. So it's not easy to just go, oh yeah, let's just invent something that doesn't wear out, because it's hard plastic object. So it kind of followed from there. Why don't we make something or try to make something that has actually got a removable surface? So you could have a consumable as the outer surface. So I brought something that hasn't been seen before. This is, let's see. This is the can you see this? There we go. This is the very first Reload sheet, which was hand cut out of a very, very thin carbon fiber textured surface. The adhesive on it, yeah, that was an interesting pain in the ass. So the idea was always, hey, let's make a thing that can be removed from the top of the paddle. But how do you do this without compromising the paddle? Remember, we talked about how important touch was. You put the wrong adhesive on this, it's going to feel dull. So I'm not going to remember exactly anymore, but let's say, I don't know, 43 or 44 was the number of adhesives that were tested before we discovered which one the right one was. This little tab over here, which you can probably see, this is a fabric tab that I cut off the back of one of my t-shirts. And if you're wondering why put a tab on there, the answer is really simple. Have you ever tried to take a Band-Aid off or take a sticker off of something else and you use your nail to try and pull it off? It's a pain in the ass. Remember UX and customer experience? That's what you want. You want the idea. So this is what this evolves into, right? This is a stock Reload sheet. And look at this little die cut pin, die cut element. So what do? You just pull it apart like that. There's no real thinking. It's just the tab. It's instinctive. And the whole idea was to try to, even from the very early days, as I was thinking about the customer delight, the user experience, how do you make this so it's easy? But yeah, the bottom line is Reload, the original idea was, how do you make something which will allow a better performance, better value, and frankly, higher sustainability? Because the idea of tossing a paddle when the surface has worn out or replacing it or buying a new one, just seemed not only overly expensive, but also silly, because same like the argument with the car and the car tires or the tennis strings. It felt like a problem that needed to be solved. It's a very long-winded way of saying that was the eureka moment when I figured out that, hang on, this is the bit that I'm interested in. This is the bit that I think is doable, and this is the bit that I think would be valuable to the most number of people, because it would make it more cheaper to play, make it more efficient, because you'd have a fresh feel of all of us know what it feels like when you hit the first ball on a brand new paddle. Like, it's crisp, it catches it really nicely, and that's what I wanted that fresh feel whenever you want, so you can just rip off a sheet and put it back on. Here, just as a demo, people sometimes ask, who haven't seen it before, how long does it take? So we don't really need a timer, but this is me taking off a sheet, and this is me putting a sheet back on. We say 10 seconds. That was a lot less than 10 seconds, but it's very easy. And that was the whole idea, is how do you make something that allows us to have a fresh paddle whenever you want.
I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. As you already know, I'm going to go into my Vuori ad, and this time I want to talk about this hoodie that I'm wearing right now. This is the Strato Tech hoodie. Now that it's starting to warm up a little bit, I've been wearing this a lot more. As you can see, this is pretty thin. This is something you could wear to dinner. I'm finding this to be more useful during the hot days where I may just want to stay covered. Super lightweight, it's moisture wicking. It keeps me covered from the sun. If you're interested in them, of course, you can go to vuori.com/buildingpickleball and you get 20% off your first purchase. And they also do free shipping on any orders of $75 or more. And they also do free returns. Oh yeah, they do tearaway tags too. Boop. Damn, that's interesting. And it's not just a fresh paddle, but based on the reviews I've seen, it's a quality paddle. Like, people like playing with it. It'd be one thing if you're like, hey, we created this removable sheet, but the paddle sucks. But like Chris, Braden, John Q, I believe all three of them have done reviews on it. Nothing but positive reviews. Chris is the one that I've watched most in depth. And he was even talking about, okay, well, like, it's great that there's a removable or replaceable face sheet. Now let's test, how does it do under duress in certain temperatures. Oh, he left it in the car at it looked really, really hot. He left it in there for like 4 hours, no problems. And it's hard to grasp something without having context. So for context and like comparison, there's another brand called Pickle. I don't know if they're still trying to do the same thing, but they have at least tried it. And their issue was they had a couple issues. One, that tab that you have is pretty important in this. Like, the Pickle's way of taking it off was not as easy, not as seamless. Also, the heat in certain temperatures was not the same. So like the adhesive, also like your extensive research of going through 44 attempts or iterations of adhesive, super, super important. So it's very interesting. I think they're Gen 2 paddles, right?
Yeah. Yes, for sure. The thermal stability is a very, very big factor, because at the end of the day, many things in this sport are, the sport is played a lot in very, very hot states, and these paddles are black. And the one thing about black paddles, lots of sunlight, massively absorb a bunch of heat. Oftentimes they're left laying on the ground, especially in an open play environment. So the ground absorbs a lot of heat, the paddle absorbs a lot of heat. You'd better make sure that all aspects of your paddle are highly thermally stable. It is very, very easy to find adhesives that will soften or break down in these kinds of temperatures. It is not easy and not cheap to find adhesives that are stable. So if you want to cut corners, or if you don't think through all the aspects of your customer experience or your use case scenarios, then problems will happen. But we've been quite careful from an engineering perspective very early on, and very much all the way through our roadmap, that we don't do that.
Yeah. Why do you think we don't see more of these paddles?
It's an interesting question. It's been... First of all, we haven't been around for a long period of time. We started, even though we're punching above our weight in terms of recognition among some aspects of the industry, for example, some of the reviewers that you mentioned, many of them awarded us most innovative paddle of the year, which was really nice to see. But we've only been around for 6 months. And in that 6 months, it's fascinating because there's a big educational step involved when you change the way in which people buy products. For example, first and foremost, a lot of people don't realize how fast paddles wear out. And the ones that sometimes, even when you explain it to them, they don't believe you because they just think, oh, no, this is just marketing. These paddles don't wear out. Look, there's nothing wrong with this paddle. I've been playing with this paddle for the last 6 months and it's totally fine. I paid $300 for this paddle. What are you talking about? This paddle wears out in 50 hours of play. But even when someone is resistant like that, if you say to them, okay, try a brand new one of that exact same paddle that you've been playing with, they'll go, wow, now I really feel the difference. I'm like, well, why do you think that is? So, number one, there's an educational step of people understanding that such a thing is necessary. Number two, it's the second educational step of people understanding it's possible. And number three, you're fighting against the whole industry. Because think about it, most of the companies out there are selling a roughly $25 to $30 landed product, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. For those of you who don't know, the slang term landed means the exact cost of an object when it lands in the United States, assuming we're talking about the US. And when I say the exact cost, it means the cost of the materials, the cost of manufacturing, the cost of shipping, the cost of customs, all those costs combined together averaged out for a single paddle. So roughly $25 is what a paddle costs. But if you're selling this thing for $250, it's good business to just keep selling it over and over and over again. In the short term, it might feel like it's not good business to do a razor blade model where you sell someone the stick or what we call the paddle base, and then you keep selling them refills. So there are a number of different types, or let's try that again. There are a number of different aspects of this industry, from consumer spending habits, consumer understanding and education, to the way in which the brands have currently conducted their business, but even retailers. There are multiple retailers, some of which I enjoy quite good friendships with, who tell me things like, I don't want this to exist because I want customers to come in after a certain period of weeks or months and buy another paddle because I make more money that way. And that's totally understandable. That is the reality of business, is when you're going, well, hang on a second, we're altering the business model. You're going to, as a disruptor, what are you going to do? You're going to disrupt. You're going to upset the apple cart. So let's just say that it's been a very fascinating process understanding what works and what doesn't work. But I'll give you one clue that I take significant comfort from, that we're on the right track. Most of the big paddle companies have directly come to us to discuss licensing, because even while they may not say so publicly, they're all very much aware of how much of a problem it is that their equipment degrades so fast. They're selling premium products for significantly over $200 in some cases, where one of the key functions of that product wears out in 50 hours of play or less. That is not a good look, and it's not sustainable longer term. But finding out how to marry the business model of selling picks and shovels in a proverbial gold rush with something that's a very sensible approach to prolonging performance and much better value and a more sustainable solution, that is an interesting challenge, and that's one we're undergoing right now with a number of different entities in this space. Does that make sense as an answer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Damn, that's interesting.
But I'll give you one more thing. We skipped over the USA Pickleball bit, which we can get to, but I'll address one thing. For example, people often ask, they'll say stuff like, this is just a random example paddle. They go, hey, I own this paddle already. Can I just take this thing and put it on my paddle? Why not, right? My grit's worn out. Why can't I just do that? And the answer to that question is a little bit nuanced, because at the end of the day, while this is a very sophisticated, specially made, with pull tab and thermally stable adhesive, etc., product, it is a sticker. So you can just stick it. You can stick it onto this table. You could stick it onto your chest, and you can stick it onto a raw carbon fiber paddle. But there are two specific reasons as to why you might not want to do that. Reason number one is that this this product, it's hard to see because it's dark on dark, but you can obviously see it on the website. This is a USA Pickleball approved paddle, but it is only USA Pickleball approved in the configuration it is submitted in. In other words, this paddle base combined with this sheet. If, as we are doing right now, we have a 14 millimeter version of the paddle, that is a new paddle because it is a different paddle base. Even if it has the same sheets, it's still a different paddle base. So that means that if you were to take this sheet, or any other sheet for that matter, and stick it onto your own paddle, you would immediately be creating an illegal paddle. Now, you might go, I don't care. I'm not playing in any sanctioned tournaments. I'm playing rec play. I don't care at all that I've got a paddle that's illegal. I just want to play with it, and I don't want to pay $250 for a new one. I want to refresh my grit. Then you have a second problem. The second problem is weight and balance. When you have a paddle that is balanced when you're playing, you don't want to be putting extra weight onto it, a significant amount of extra weight, because then you create a paddle that is head heavy, which means it's no longer balanced, which means it won't play the same way as what you're used to. So regardless of how heavy or light other objects are, you don't want to be adding them to a paddle that is already made and designed by a manufacturer to play a certain way. So that is why we call this, one of the taglines we have is, this is not a paddle, this is a paddle system. It's precisely because of this. This is a system that's a combination of sheets and a paddle base. So all the companies that we're in discussions on licensing with, the whole idea is step one, design a paddle base, and then design a paddle base that works when you put these two sheets, and you work backwards. You start with your swing weight, twist weight, static weight parameters that you want to achieve, and you reverse engineer from that what you want the paddle base to be like, and there you have your paddle system. Does that help understand a bit more?
Yeah. I mean, the weight wouldn't be that much of a concern, right? Because, I mean, people are like modifying paddles regardless. Well, not everyone, but they're adding like lead tape. So that's changing the like attributes of the paddle. So like if I wouldn't slap a sheet on a paddle that's not a non-reload paddle, but maybe someone wants to.
There are definitely some people who do. In very initially, we had a lot of people who use paddles that have painted on grit, the stuff that we talked about that wears out really fast, and they were expensive paddles with painted on grit, and they were looking for a solution to do that. But yeah, the main thing here is, my broader vision for this is very simple. In the same way that all tennis rackets have strings, I think it's not only possible, but plausible and desirable for all pickleball paddles in the future to have replaceable surfaces. There will be a ton of different core styles. We've already seen this, that some people are leaning into floating cores, some people are leaning into foam cores, some people are leaning into hybrid foam and floating cores. And that's just this year. That's going to continue to evolve. But at the end of the day, regardless of what kind of a core you have and how much of a trampoline / catapult / whatever PB core flavor of the month thing these companies are having to engineer around, the bottom line is they've got a surface that's going to wear out. And that's the bit. I think there needs to be an uncoupling of core tech and core engineering and competition versus surface. So there have been a couple of companies that there's no reason to name who early on in Reload said, yeah, we want this right away, but we want exclusivity. And I said to all of them, no, you can't have it. And they said, well, why not? We're a big company. Don't you want this as a partner? And I said, well, yeah, of course I do. But there's a broader vision here. And the broader vision is this should be for everybody, because I'm trying to fundamentally alter the way in which the sport and the sports players use and consume their products.
So it'll be interesting, though, because like, what does dwell time count for too as well? So, yeah.
It's a very this gets nuanced really, really quickly, but there are obviously, dwell time is super important, but it's important to remember that dwell time, while some people think of dwell time as an input, as in, oh yeah, high dwell time means X, it's not convenient to think of it that way because it's not correct. Dwell time is an output. So different aspects of paddle design and construction affect the dwell time. Dwell time itself doesn't affect anything at all. It can't. It would be like saying that, the smell of a food impacts the ingredients in it. No, that's the wrong way around. The causal relationship is what you put into food as ingredients affects its smell. So in this case, it is absolutely true that you can affect dwell time. You can affect a bunch of different things with the way in which all aspects of the paddle are constructed. Even though it's not common to think of a paddle as having a frame and a string bed, because it doesn't, more and more we see that paddles are constructed to behave exactly like that. They'll have a stiffened outer frame and they'll have a quote-unquote flexible string bed. But the entire vertical stack of the paddle core, culminating with these surface sheets and the type of adhesive that's used, that stuff is a massive difference on how the paddle plays. So for example, we've noticed that when you put a Reload sheet on a paddle design that's quite rigid and poppy, it softens it and actually makes the paddle play better. So it needs to be taken into consideration when you are designing paddles to have replaceable surfaces. But yeah, it's a massively important part. There's some very interesting stuff that I can't yet show you that's coming down the pipe, where, for example, we might have, in the not too distant future, 2 or 3 different types of sheets, where one sheet might be purely focused on a control/high spin environment, whereas another sheet might be power focused. But simply by changing an incredibly thin sheet, we can completely alter the way in which the paddle plays.
Yeah. Damn. When you think about it that way.
Sorry about that, but yeah, the boof.
Yeah, well, when you think about it that way, like, damn, like how I could see a lot of companies be like, how do I get on this train?
Yeah, but that's the whole idea, is that very early on, this is going back to slightly high level entrepreneur thinking, but I had an interesting problem to contemplate. And that is, we're going to skip slightly to a different industry right now and pick outdoor clothing just for shits and giggles. So if you don't know what these brands are when you're listening to this stuff, you probably do, because I'll use big name brands, but if you don't, just Google them. For example, is Reload Gore-Tex, i.e. an enabling technology, or is it Arc'teryx and North Face, i.e. a brand that people know and trust to provide a premium performance in their chosen field? And there's a very specific reason as to why I chose it to be both initially. For example, if you go out and try and find a Gore-Tex jacket made by Gore-Tex, you will fail, because that doesn't happen. But the key thing is, it doesn't happen anymore. In the early days, Gore-Tex had to do exactly that. They had to make jackets because otherwise, if they just showed up at a company and they said, hey guys, do you want to look at this really new thing, this new kind of waterproof breathable membrane? It's like totally the shit. Everybody's going to want to use it. The companies would shrug their shoulders and go, why would we want that? We've got our own thing and everybody buys our tents and our jackets. There's nothing wrong with them. Go away. So there needed to be a certain push, I guess let's call it a proof of concept by Gore-Tex to push people in that direction. Gore-Tex chose to then focus their brand on being an enabling technology. But something is fascinating within pickleball where that's an obvious path for Reload to take. But when I look around, it's actually interesting, because I think there's a lot of room in pickleball to establish a brand on top of that also. You can go into any single pickleball shop and look around at the bags and the paddles and the balls, and it all kind of sort of looks same. There really isn't that much of a distinctive visual voice, a distinctive merchandising voice, distinctive photography, clear decisions that are being made on a creative level. So one of the reasons that I was excited to pursue Reload wasn't just all the stuff that I talked about from the perspective of the technical aspects, but it was also the brand. Like there was a lot of luck. There's a lot of luck involved in all aspects of entrepreneurship. But in this particular case with Reload, I was amazed that the name was available. The fact that I could get a Class 26 trademark for Reload, it just seemed like it's so obvious. It's like what it says on the tin. You're reloading your paddle. But the fact that was around, I don't know, it was kind of lucky. It was lucky to come up with a name. It was lucky that no one had filed any IP in this space before. It was lucky that we got the IP. It's never only luck. It's always a combination of luck, timing, skill, perseverance, like with most things in entrepreneurship. But yeah, and it was obviously a combination of all those things that help to convince USA Pickleball to allow this kind of solution to exist.
How did you convince them to allow this? Because it's a modification that's happening like to the paddle? Like someone could replace it mid-game, which I believe you're not allowed to, right? You can't make modifications to the paddle.
So all very good questions. So the easiest way that I can explain it is there's lots of there's a lot of, let's try that again. No rules system for equipment governance in a sport that's growing explosively is entirely static. So we've seen, and we're living through this right now with things like the PB core changes and the spin rule changes. We're living through an environment where, as manufacturers get more and more capable of pushing against the rules and designing around them, the governing bodies or the certification bodies will respond in various different ways. Sometimes with rules changes, sometimes with penalties, sometimes with delistings, sometimes with a combination of new testing techniques and rule changes. But in this particular case, it is 100% true that in the early days, when we first approached USA Pickleball, there was a very specific rule that said I can't remember the exact wording, but in effect it said no removable elements on the face of the paddle whatsoever, period, full stop. Okay? So clearly, such a rule would have been highly problematic for a solution like this, unless you were going to make a solution that essentially had no, it wasn't USAP approved. It was like, hey guys, you can put a sticker on the paddle. If you do, that's great. If not, thanks, see you later. Which I had no interest in doing. But like all stewards of a sport, as I said, these rules and these governing bodies, they listen to feedback. So very early on, USA Pickleball was approached, and we said, look, why does this rule exist? And they said, it's for danger reasons. Because a long time ago, people were putting, they would put screw-in weights and they would get dislodged, and there was a big concern that somebody would get injured. So basically, we made a blanket rule that banned any kind of modifications of that kind. And let's just say that it took a decent amount of time to explain and get buy-in from USA Pickleball to understand that there's significant benefits in a system like this overall for the entire industry, as in all aspects of the industry. Because again, it sounds like a broken record, but if you're able to make a product that previously was essentially became, not dead, but way less effective than a customer might have expected or a player might have expected in such a short period of time, then if you could relatively cost-effectively solve a performance and a sustainability problem, that seems like a really, really good thing for the sport overall, especially when you consider international markets. I mean, it's sometimes easy to get lost, especially if you live in the world of paddle nerds who will think nothing of dropping $250 or $300 every 1 to 2 months on a brand new paddle because they just want to have whatever the latest flavor is that the big companies have released. It's easy to get lost in that world and forget that pickleball is about to grow explosively internationally. And India, Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, China, they're not going to support a $250 to $300 paddle price point. It's just not going to happen. The rest of the world won't do that. The cost of playing pickleball from an equipment perspective is way too high. It'll be one thing if we're talking about a premium product that lasts for a really long time. But the simultaneous thing of a premium product that degrades super fast, that is a non-starter in international markets. So I think USA Pickleball understood. They had the foresight to see that was coming. So they did not make this easy. So the fact is that in order for a system like this to be approved, it has to be used in the that's why the rule exists now, that it has to be used in the configuration it's tested in. So yes, you could take the sheet off and put it onto another paddle, as we talked about, but that's not legal. But as far as taking the sheet off and swapping it with another one, that is 100% legal, because that's exactly what was tested. So they did a bunch of different tests to do exactly that. Now, we talked about the fact that the adhesive was thermally stable. There's one other key thing to point out. That is, there's no adhesive residue here. And that is one of the big things about this kind of adhesive. That's one of the reasons why it's so expensive. So basically, no matter how many times you take off and remove this sheet, it will have the same mechanical characteristics and the same playing characteristics. And that was a big reason convincing USA Pickleball that such a procedure was possible and that this type of adhesive would never fly off, because the funny part is the more you hit balls on this, the more sticky it gets, not the other way around. So
that's insane.
Lots of conversations, but at the end of the day, conversations are one thing, data is another thing.
Yeah.
Very, very early on, I asked for USAP's guidance, and I was fortunate to get it in doing what I believe is the first ever research on how fast paddles wear out. Again, this was not looking at degradation in the way in which it's being discussed these days, namely how fast do the cores degrade or how fast do the floating cores loosen and the paddle becomes hot. This was specifically about how fast does the grit wear out. So we constructed a test. Namely, we defined what a day was. Well, it was roughly 2 hours of play, and I want to say, it's written down somewhere, I want to say it was about 500 forehands. And we just did it over and over again. We would scan the surface of the paddle, and we were not scanning the surface of the paddle with a Starrett SR160, which is what was in use at the time. We were using $500,000 worth of laser microscope of the kind that no governing body has even today, because they don't think that they don't need that level of fidelity. We wanted it because we wanted to know what exactly was happening on the surfaces of these paddles and how did it change after one day, 2 days, 3 days. And in the end, we were amazed to discover that consistently across the board, regardless of whether we use the lower resolution, more common, low cost roughness testing system or the really expensive ones, the result was consistent. You lose about 50% of your surface roughness in 50 hours of play on a raw carbon fiber paddle. And that was, a very interesting piece of data. So that has been published. It's published on the website. It's published actually as a scientific paper as well, but I don't think many people aren't nerdy enough to have dug out that paper. I'll ask one question that some people will go, "What? But wait a minute, Nick, wait a minute. Surface roughness is not the only thing that causes spin, right?" It's true. You said... Correct. Yeah, you said what the only thing that causes spin was, which is dwell time, right? Dwell time's the output, but surface roughness contributes significantly to spin because, I mean, if you imagine two different paddles, one of which is incredibly soft and can cup the ball, they have the same surface roughness. One is incredibly soft and the other one is very, very rigid. Which one can you induce more spin with? It's obvious, the soft one, because it'll have way more dwell time. But on a given paddle, if everything else is the same, the only thing that varies is the surface roughness. So on a given paddle, you better believe that surface roughness has a massive component in spin. If you don't believe it, go out and hit a fresh paddle and then hit a worn out paddle and you'll know the difference right away. There's a reason why pros want to swap out paddles on a frequent basis, and it's because of the surface roughness.
Do you have plans to get this UPA approved?
That's another interesting question. So UPA approvals are complicated for a couple of different reasons. One, because they're extraordinarily expensive. When UPA first leaked, I say leaked in quotes because I'm assuming it was a leak because it seemed like it was communicated in a strange way. When they first released the information that it was going to be $100,000 a year to participate in UPA at a pro level, a number of us scratched their heads going, wait a second, a minute ago it was $1,500 for life, and now it's $100,000 per year. So $1,500 for life on USAP and $100,000 per year on UPA. So I remember thinking, well, that's crazy. What's that going to do? So there are a number of different business reasons as to why I believe UPA might be doing this, ranging from they want to reduce the number of paddle companies that are involved because it annoys them to have little ones, or they want to protect the big sponsors that they have because it annoys them to have little ones, or they want to quote unquote make things more fair and more transparent. I'm not sure exactly how you satisfy that third one by charging companies $100,000 a year, but that's a more different and more involved discussion point. The question you asked was, what would Reload do with regards to UPA approvals? Well, The UPA did something else that makes answering that question quite complicated, which is the UPA has decided that replaceable sheets like Reload are not legal for pro play in the UPA no matter what. It's nothing to do with paying for it. So, for example, any other company that has a USAP approved paddle, all they have to do to get UPA approved is pay a large chunk of cash and pass their tests. Reload is not allowed to do that. Or rather, Reload is allowed to do that, but if Reload pays the large amount of money and passes the UPA tests, Reload paddles would still not be allowed in pro brackets. So, in point of fact, Reload paddles have already passed the UPA tests as a result of the fact that there was lots of open communication between the research lab that UPA uses, PPL, and myself. So a number of months ago, the tests were run and the tests were passed. But nonetheless, a decision was made to make Reload illegal for UPA. Why that decision was made? Well, it's a very, very complicated discussion and involves things that are way beyond the scope of this podcast. But it's a very interesting decision if you think about it, because here's what the rule says. It says no removable 9.1, I think it is. I might be wrong, but let's call it 9.1. Rule 9.1. No removable elements of any kind are allowed on a paddle in pro play. Rule 9.1b. Exceptions to the above rule include butt caps, overgrips, OEM grips, aesthetic and decorative edge tapes, weighted edge tapes. Guess what it doesn't include? This. So basically, that rule is a Reload ban for pro play. Why would a small innovative company be banned from pro play? That's a subject for some discussion. Perhaps not now. Yeah, it can be hard, but one of the things, it's incumbent in any environment, whether it's on the mat or in a war or in business, to understand the context and the perspective of why people are doing stuff. There's a lot of money in pickleball.
Oh, yeah.
No, I know you know the answer, but I'm just sort of trying to frame it a bit more. There's a lot of money in pickleball, and the thing about money is that money demands a return. So if people have a sense that there's money to be made, and one of the ways to make money is, well, it's high risk, but if we just keep getting these guys to buy stuff over and over again, we'll make a lot more money. Yeah, they're right. They're right. On a given single paddle sale, it is much better to sell 3 paddles to someone than to sell them this. But in the long run, and I think about something as in terms of the why, is looking at the long run, looking at the big picture. If you want from an entrepreneurship perspective, looking at the exit. Because there are entrepreneurs out there who will tell you, yeah, I'm doing this for altruistic reasons. I want to make the world a better place. Okay, that's good. I mean, yes, I want to improve the way in which the sport is played and the way in which equipment is consumed. But at the end of the day, if there wasn't a path to an exit, it would be very foolish of me to devote my time, and it would be completely disingenuous for me to ask investors to give me their money. So I'm always thinking about an exit in some way, no matter what the idea is. But it's not something that you click your fingers, to use the example I gave you before. The customer is not a cow to milk, much as we might like to think of them that way, because customer walks in with a credit card and you want to see how many things can you sell them. I think of it more as a lifetime value, in the same way you were discussing story and UX. It's not about here's a product, use it. It's all aspects of that. If I can get that mix correctly for the brand and for the product and for the products that are continuing to come out, that's the win. The other stuff will take care of itself. But I think honestly, there is a certain this shit goes way beyond the paddle nerds. Like, it's tempting. We sit here and we debate one PB core test versus another. 99.9% of people don't give a fuck because they don't know. They're never going to know, and they don't care. They just want to play pickleball. And herein lies what I think is the biggest risk. The biggest risk is that they stop caring completely. And here's what I mean by that. So I have a friend who I happen to be the pickleball ambassador for Croatia. And it's just because I set that up early on. I put together pickleballcroatia.com, and I put a bunch of resources on there just to help grow the sport there. I painted one of the first courts in the country. Doesn't matter. The point is that it's now starting to take on a life of its own. And a good friend of mine opened the first dedicated pickleball facility, 4-court facility with lights, really nice, in the capital. He's doing a 12-court facility in the next 3 months. And he told me about 2 months ago, he's like, dude, it's really tough to sell paddles. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, we have a bunch of Yola paddles because we were like a mini Yola center of some kind. And he's like, no one wants to buy them. They're like 200 euros. And I said, oh, what do they buy instead? Because I should point out, there's no other paddle stores in the country. Like, literally nowhere else you can buy a paddle. He goes, oh, they just buy them from AliExpress and Temu. And I said, but what are they just buying, like crappy knockoffs? He goes, yeah, but they're not crappy.
Yeah.
They're the same.
Someone had it yesterday at Urban.
Well, no. So here's the funny part: so these are experienced. Croatia's chock full of tennis players. Like they've got. I think for a country of such a small size, they have a significant number of players in the top 100, male and female, in the ATP and the WTA. These players who are experienced tennis players are trying the demo paddles that they have there, and then trying the knockoff ones, and they're just going, well, the knockoff one is like almost identical. And even if it isn't, it costs 1/10 of the price, so I'll just keep buying that. And that's the worrying part. The worrying part, when you have two standards organizations fighting like this and restricting innovation and R&D, it's not that pickleball's going to die. No, almost nothing can kill pickleball now. Because it's so enjoyable, it's so social. Yes, sure, one could take a view that pro pickleball has big issues. They have big issues because they keep promising these big returns to invest and they don't happen. They have big issues because if you go to an MLP event, there's like 5.5 people watching, and 4.5 of those 5.5 are friends and or family members and or sponsors. So there are definitely issues with pro pickleball, but pickleball's not going anywhere. Pickleball's just going to grow. But if this continues, the war of the paddle companies and the standards organizations and all this bullshit bullying of small entities, it's going to kill the brands or significantly damage them. Because if a standards organization suddenly becomes irrelevant, because if the consumers get confused or irritated, they just go, why do I care about this USA Pickleball? I know of at least 2 brands that are not bothering with UPA or USAP. Now, if you rewind the clock and doing really well, if you rewind the clock 2 years, the only person who I know of who tried that is Diadem with the Vice, and almost nobody bought it because they were like, oh no, that thing's weird and illegal. It would be like going to a grocery store and buying expired yogurt. You'd be like, no, I can't buy no, it's past its sell-by date. I could get a disease. And that in those days, the idea of not having a USA Pickleball approved paddle was considered death to that particular paddle. But there are, as I said, there are at least 2 companies now who are going, what if we skip it? Because if we skip it, then if people buy it anyway because they enjoy it, and it's a precipice, right? Because if we allow that sort of stuff to happen, then we combine the skipping of the USAP or UPA with the Temu, AliExpress, cheaper knockoffs, which are not approved anyway, but people are enjoying themselves. We lose all control of the sport and brands get significantly hurt. And that is bad all around. So what needs to happen here is much more simplified testing and only one standard. And I think it's pretty clear which standard 99% of companies will prefer.
Damn, dude.
There's lots of shit in there, yeah.
It's refreshing to have this conversation, though. Why I think it's because most people aren't really in this much, or they're not as I think that's what it actually is. It's like I think most people are like maybe I don't know how to word it. Maybe they're like the B players. You're kind of like an A. You're like at the face of this. Like you're the one who's having to deal with this. There's plenty of other brands, but most of them aren't having this conversation with or encountering like these kind of like conflicts.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is interesting. It's a couple of people have said that, how are, like, for example, people who are not in pickleball, entrepreneurs in other businesses, they'll go, hey, how's it going? How's the business going? And it's an interesting question because we're 6 months out of the gate, and while obviously it's great that we have decent sales and things are growing, and international things are coming in here and there. For example, a typical story will be, I'll happen to see a sale go to Malaysia, and it'll be like 2 paddles. I'm like, oh cool, somebody in Malaysia's heard of Reload. How awesome. Yay, congratulations. And then a week later, I'll get an email from the same person saying, yeah, can I buy 250 paddles, please? Because we're trying to make something happen, and I love this brand, and I bought those 2 paddles as a test. So having inbound interest like that when you're a small team and you don't have a distribution specialist, an international licensing specialist, when you're doing things that's relatively small scale, focusing mostly on the US market, it's fascinating to see stuff like that. But at the same time, we have a disproportionate amount of impact overall in the sport. Because as you said, I'm at the forefront of discussions about governance and specifically about what might be a better way to do testing and certification of paddles. And I don't take that. That's a very, very fortunate position to be in, and I don't take that lightly at all. So this panel at racquetx, this was my idea back in December, after lots of conversations amongst various different paddle companies about what to do and what's happening. Because if you recall, the Palm Springs tournament was the first one that had to have UPA quote-unquote approval on it of some capacity. So everybody got into this panic saying, well, what does this mean? What are we going to do? These guys want a significant amount of money for this to go forwards. So I started thinking, hang on a second, there's a lot of people who are panicking, a lot of people who need some clarity. And it was interesting because it was clear that there were some companies that were more invested in trying to shape this than others. And I don't know, I ended up in a position where multiple companies spoke to me. So Yola and Selkirk and Gearbox and USAP and UPA, I managed to convince all of them to come and participate in a roundtable discussion. Because there's a lot of, there are companies that are convinced that other companies are the reason why they got delisted. There are other companies that are convinced that there's collusion happening at multiple different levels behind the scenes, that everything is corrupt. But my view was that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Let's attack this problem, because every single person on that panel is in some way 2 things. 1, a part of the problem, but 2, contains within them an ability to solve the problem. So if I end up being the voice which happens to in some way channel this towards a positive outcome, so be it.
How do you address collusion? Like in the context of pickleball?
Collusion is a very heavy word, because collusion, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the legal implication precisely of collusion, but the way, conversationally speaking, collusion would mean that companies and or individuals are having conversations behind the scenes that will then disproportionately favor one group or one company versus another one. This is a profit-motivated environment. There are investors out there. I mean, consider this. You have an organization in the UPA, which controls the pro leagues, not all the pro leagues, certainly not PWR and APP, but controls the pro leagues with the most high-profile players, I think it would be fair to say, in the United States. And that same organization, or the parent of that organization, also owns a paddle company, and that same organization also sets the rules for paddle companies. I mean, it's not, technically speaking, all of this could exist, but it would be kind of like if the organization that controls what kind of Formula One cars are allowed to race and what are they allowed to put in their engines also happened to own a Formula One car. It's a little weird. It's not exactly the arm's length independence that one would hope for. The profit motivation thing makes things even more complicated. But you asked about how to address it. Well, step 1 is you have to discover, does it exist? Because it might not. It might just be business is business. People have conversations in business all day, every day. Competitors have conversations in business But whether or not conversations in business or strategic decisions meet the legal definition of collusion, who knows? But if they do, then addressing them is a totally different thing. In some cases, you can address them, the market will address them, like competitive dynamics will address them. In some cases, one might have to do other things. But yeah, they're very heavy words. I mean, it would be like it's like in a sport, you go, well, how do you address cheating? Okay, well, step one is it happening? If it isn't happening, okay. If it is happening, at what level is it happening? Is it happening at paddle level? Is it happening because people are calling points in the wrong way deliberately? Is there a pattern of that? How do you fix that? Do you address it with referees? Do you address it with cameras? Do you address it with penalties? So whether you're talking about it at the equipment level or the politics level or the sports or the playing of the actual points level, you always have to consider step one, identify whether something is happening. Step two, try and understand what is the cause of it happening and who are the actors involved. You could say, oh, follow the money. Yeah, okay, follow the money is an easy thing to say. It's a lot harder to do. At the end of the day, my view is that almost all the organizations involved in the sport of pickleball have a common goal, namely they want pickleball to grow. Because they all either A, like the sport, or B, make money from the sport, or ideally both of those things. I mean, it would be a bit strange for somebody to have a big business in pickleball but hate pickleball. Sure, Andy Roddick, he doesn't like pickleball, but he plays in the pickleball slams because he makes a shit ton of money when he does it. Fine, that's okay. But I'm talking about on a more organizational level. Most of these companies are interested in pickleball growing. They're interested in pickleball becoming more widespread, more people playing, more paddles get bought, more people enjoying themselves. So I don't think anybody sets out to deliberately do bad things, except there's an element of where there's smoke, there's sure to be a fire. At the end of the day, if you get enough signals that indicate that things are not how they could or should be, whether it's because of misinformation or whether it's because of direct outright bullying tactics, there are certain lines that get crossed. And again, there's a big difference between regular course of justice, the way business is conducted, and hey, it's just marketing. For example, let's take something that's much simpler than complicated Game of Thrones like politics. Let's consider when you sell a paddle and you market it as containing titanium, but it actually contains yellow polyester. Is that bad? I don't know. I mean, from an engineer's perspective, it's like it would cause me to spit out my food. I would never do such a thing in a million years. But like, if people don't understand and they don't care, all they want is a paddle, and they buy a paddle because it says titanium and it doesn't have an ounce of titanium in it. Is anyone being defrauded? What does I'm going to make up a name now, but what does like cold fusion carbon mean? Nothing. It's a made-up term, but there are plenty of companies out there that will use pseudo-sci-fi terminology as marketing,
yeah.
And nobody calls that illegal or misinformation, or there's no collusion in that. What I'm trying to say is that it's always a fine line, and at some point it's a little bit like the old Senate definition of pornography. I'll know it when I see it, but it's hard to define. There are a lot of things in pickleball that feel like, okay, that seems like normal business. I may not like it, but it is what it is. It's marketing. But there are some things that just cross the line. And when that line cross happens, that's what I believe pickleball needs to take a long, hard look in the mirror and say, is this the kind of industry that we want to be?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that, like, this isn't obvious. This is like somewhat hypothetical if you're the titanium example, but like, how many other people does it hurt? Obviously, it's somewhat like misleading to the consumer. But if we're looking at a larger scale example, and most people can probably make the assumption of who or what I might be talking about, but if you created a governing body organization after one already exists, and that governing body organization is owned by a tournament organization in which pro players play, and then they make the rules. And mind you, the pro tournament is important because it has sponsors that the sponsors are paddle brands. And if a governing body organization can make the rules and regulations on which paddles and paddle companies are or are not allowed, and then in the tournament play, then that is like significantly different versus maybe using a marketing
I believe if you looked up in the dictionary conflict of interest, it might be exactly what you just described.
Yeah.
And no, I agree.
Yeah, and that seems much more severe than someone maybe like labeling something as like titanium using some buzzword or word that may not have been referenced before to describe an attribute or a feature to a product. But then, yeah, when you go into like, hey, this is a much larger much larger thing that's happening and that affects multiple companies, and it all trickles down to the consumer, which is like what we've been talking about is the consumer at the end of the day is this can't survive without the consumer. So yeah, that is interesting.
I agree. No, it's a fascinating time. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the reasons why all of this stuff is happening is because pickleball is growing. So it's growing so fast, and the growing pains. There's a lot of people who are taking a look at pickleball and just going, "Oh, I don't know what this is, but yeah, let's throw some dollars in this and see what happens." Because balance the portfolio. These guys look like they want to spend money. That sounds cool. Let's do it. So it's not. At the end of the day, it's not about, for me at least, it's not about trying to do everything. There's no point in trying to do everything absolutely perfectly, either on an organizational level or on every other level. You have to decide which battles are important to fight, because at the end of the day, to use that example you threw back at me, which is the titanium example, is it that big a deal? Probably not. I mean, sure, it might be irritating, but it's not that big a deal. Or if you take even a smaller example, when you look at a poster for an event that you're sponsoring and some name is misspelt, sure, it's annoying on the day, but is it that big a deal? No, not really. But when you look at decisions that are being made at a very high level in terms of the politics of the sport, and you consider, is this longer term a net positive for the sport or a net negative for the sport? If it's longer term a net negative and you do nothing about that, I mean, if you have the ability, whether you're a paddle brand or an influencer or anybody else, if you have the ability to do something about it, you have a platform, use it. Because this is how we all collectively get to fix the sport. Because collectively, it's like, sure, there's only one organization that has the two biggest pro leagues in the US that's significantly majority owned by a very rich individual. But there's millions of us, and without the people who are buying these paddles or watching and playing the sport, those organizations have no meaning or power. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how this. Make no mistake, by the way, I enjoy watching pro pickleball. I enjoy it because it's an inspiration, and it helps define aspects of how the products are designed, be they balls or paddles or courts or nets or whatever. And I enjoy watching it because I'm on top of all the other entrepreneurial stuff, I'm also a player. I enjoy playing, and I'm constantly trying to improve and see different ways in which I can improve. But at the same time, it's like I can't not see the negative aspects of what's going on in the politics, which means I have a choice to make. Is do I sit back and wait for the sport to just go in any direction it feels like? Or if I see that there's something positive to be done here, do I try and do the positive thing? And that's what I've always tried to do. Whether it's to kind of wrap this back to the beginning of that question when you asked me, which is, how did this come about and why did you do this? It was done because I saw there was a problem and I thought I could solve it, and I thought it would benefit a lot of people. And it's the same thing here. If I see something that is an interesting problem on the political side and I think I can help in any way by fostering a discussion, then I'll do it, and hopefully I'm able to be at least somewhat successful.
What's the ideal outcome of the conversation?
You're talking about from the politics perspective?
For racquetx.
I mean,
actually, for the people that don't know, could you add some context, like the date? You already mentioned who's involved.
Oh yeah, let me look it up. I forgot. Is it March 22nd?
The 22nd?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's on March 22nd. Yeah. It's at
yeah.
racquetx.
So at there's I missed racquetx last year, but racquetx is either one of the biggest or the biggest racket sports convention of the year. It takes place in Miami, and it's March. I think it's like 2 or 3 days. But this particular panel we're talking about is on March 22nd, and the idea here is the title of the panel is Regulation or Revolution. Or maybe that's the subtitle of the panel. Either way, that's what it's about. Regulation or revolution. Because, make no mistake, no paddle company in all of pickleball wants there to be multiple standards. Not a single one. Regardless of whether you are quote-unquote aligned with UPA or quote-unquote aligned with USAP. Nobody, regardless of who they're aligned with, wants to have multiple standards. Multiple standards are expensive to build to. They're expensive to test for. And on top of that, they're confusing for consumers. So why do they exist? Well, that's what this panel seeks to address and discuss. What caused us to get here? How do we get out of this? And the people involved are Rafael Filippini from Gearbox, Gordon Kay from Yola, Tom Barnes from Selkirk, and Carl Schmitz from USA Pickleball, and Jason Aspis from UPA. So these are all people who are either direct owners or partial owners or high-level executives of their respective organizations, all very much thought leaders in the space, all quite outspoken, and so they should be. And I'm very fortunate that they've agreed to share some of the time in their busy schedule and come down to racquetx and have this discussion. Now, you asked about what is the ideal outcome of such a discussion. Well, it's tricky to answer that genuinely in a short format, because in reality, when you have a 1 hour long slot and a bunch of heavy hitters like that, you're not going to sit there and come up with some kind of a conclusion off the cuff. So the primary aim of this discussion is to bring to light some of the problems that we all know about and we talk about behind the scenes, but no one really says it out loud. It is my genuine hope that by saying it out loud, it will force the discussion to continue in a more prolonged way. But if you ask a longer version of that question, which is what do I see as the solution going forward, I think longer term, splitting standards for pickleball when it's in such a nascent state, especially internationally, is very complicated. And I think it shouldn't happen. I think we should only have one standard. I'll tell you a simple reason as to why. If there was only one standard, chances are every other country would adopt it. The moment you have more than one standard, can you imagine, what do you think China's going to do with its paddles? Are they going to pick UPA or USAP, or are they going to do their own? I'm willing to bet they'll do their own. And when you do that, all of a sudden it's going to be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And at that point, you might as well have no standards. So in reality, because why? Because you're going to have, what's a brand supposed to do with 7 standards? Are you going to design 7 different paddles or put 7 different graphics on all of your paddles? Theoretically, you could do that, but it's a pain in the ass. These standards are so similar. Look, Yola released a paddle that's dual approved as well as UPA only approved. They are literally the exact same paddle, if I understand correctly, except for the grit. So the standards are exceptionally similar, yet not quite exactly the same. The pain involved from an engineering, customer confusion, and governance perspective is entirely unnecessary and almost arbitrary. So what do I think is the broader solution? I think the broader solution is, number one, have only one standard. Number two, have an organization / expert group, whether it's an organization like PEMA, so Pickleball Equipment Manufacturers Association, or something under the SFIA, where a number of different companies, and all should have a voice. All the pro leagues should have a voice. APP, PPA, MLP, PWR, the international pro leagues. All of these people should have a voice in the equipment manufacturing. What does it look like? What are the standards? How do you test for it? And so one governing body, presumably led by the equipment manufacturers, that determines how these things are made and tested. Because frankly, the idea of not having that is just a complicated mess. In general, I think the solution to this is only one standard and every company on board. And when I say every company, I don't just mean, oh yeah, the companies that support USA Pickleball. I'm talking about all of them. For as much as Yola, just to use that as an example, is perceived as being in UPA's camp, Yola has a massive interest in resolving all of these scenarios because it's just like for every paddle company, it's important for Yola to not have to develop multiple paddles just to satisfy multiple different standards when they're almost exactly the same. So any future solution which involves companies jointly determining what do tests look like, what does equipment certification look like, has to involve all the stakeholders. And I include in those stakeholders the pro leagues. So I just think it's completely daft to have multiple different standards. And I'm pretty certain that virtually every stakeholder in the business agrees with me. The tricky part will be which of the standards becomes the standard. And I think that in the long run, it's certainly not going to be up to me to decide, but it'll be up to the overall community of the paddle brands as well as the consumer / retailers to decide what do they think makes more sense. Something that's independent and not profit motivated versus something that's profit motivated and owned and controlled by a pro league.
I mean, how have they figured it out in other sports or just in other industries?
It's messy and different. It depends. So, for example, you can point, if you want to, you can point to examples which have gone in multiple different ways. Let's say, for the sake of argument, the NBA. In the NBA, if you want to be the official ball of the NBA, you have to pay a lot of money to the NBA because you get to put official ball of the NBA onto the ball. And people buy the official ball of the NBA because it has official ball of the NBA on it. Whereas if people buy a paddle because it's USA Pickleball approved, how much money does USA Pickleball get from that? The answer is zero, right? That even though it's using USA Pickleball's mark, USA Pickleball doesn't get any money directly from that sale. USA Pickleball only gets money when that paddle is certified. They get a certification fee. They don't get money because if that paddle sells 1 unit or 1 million units, USA Pickleball makes the same amount of money. And as it happens, that is a really interesting thing because if it was possible for the certification bodies to benefit financially from sales of products, it would be a really interesting way in which they could construct revenue. But it's almost impossible to do that. Like, how would you, for example, how would you treat them all like affiliates? How would you understand where the sales are coming from, even if you tried to do that? No one's ever done that before in a racket sport. But much as you might have that example with basketball that I gave before, you can find other pro sports where there are multiple standards. The commonly cited example is baseball bats. You'll find baseball bats that have 3 or 4 different approval certifications on them because there's multiple different certifications that a bat could pass through. A certain bat might be legal for a certain type of softball league, and another one might be legal for a different type of softball league or softball federation. And then third models might be legal for both of those, depending on what they test for. But the thing that's the most galling about pickleball is that it just seems so unnecessary. In fact, I asked Jason, this was done in public, so this is an easy one to reference. I asked Jason at a discussion panel at the PGA show, I said, hey, out of curiosity, why does this exist? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, given that pretty much every single paddle company in the industry doesn't want multiple different standards, why did you start a second standards organization? And his answer was quite interesting because his answer was, if USA Pickleball would do a better job, I wouldn't have to do any of this. Which I thought was really interesting. I'm not entirely sure that that's true, but it was a really interesting answer to give because I would imagine that can you imagine the colossal duplication of effort involved from the part of the UPA? There's a whole second lab which does pretty much the exact same stuff as the first lab. Why? Why do we need that to exist? I mean, we can talk and debate about how one PB core test is slightly different to the other PB core test, which, by the way, they're now no longer calling PB core. But why is it different? Is it really that different? And make no mistake, it's important to understand that USA Pickleball wasn't doing everything quickly enough or correctly enough. So when you have a situation where there is an existing governing body and certain things aren't being done correctly, let's just throw one out there. The OWL. Right? Why was the OWL approved for all tournaments? Had no business being approved for all tournaments, yet it happened. Who knows? There are issues that may or may not have been done there. Nobody knows the exact details other than the people who did the deal. Let's throw another one out there. Paddles were failing because the grit was illegal. No one understood why. Or when paddles were disbonding in the
They did have inconsistencies.
Yeah, it was huge inconsistencies. But here's the thing. One of the reasons for that, there are many things here that may be growing pains for an organization like USA Pickleball, where the sport grew explosively, and on top of that, paddle R&D changed very, very quickly. For a number of years, paddles were more or less exactly the same with no real changes. And all of a sudden, we had different ways of doing grit. We had totally different cores. This is before Gen 3. This is Gen 2. All of a sudden, you had a thermoformed core, which when it disbonds, or what people call delamination, but isn't really delamination, but that's really nerdy. When cores disbond, do you care or want to know the difference?
Go for it.
So here you go. So delamination is when the surface plies, i.e. the carbon fiber layers that are on the... Explain the difference between delamination and disbonding. When you look at a cross-section of a carbon fiber paddle, this happens to be a Reload paddle, but it could be any of them. So delamination is technically when these top layers, the black layers at the top that I'm holding my fingernail against, when they separate from each other, when they all separate from the core, which is what's happening in Gen 2 pickleball paddles, that is disbonding, not delamination. But everybody calls it delamination, or sometimes they call it core crushing, which is again a totally different thing. But anyway, when that stuff started happening, USA Pickleball wasn't quick enough to respond to the problems. But on top of that, their communication is sometimes quite difficult. For example, there are plenty of people out there who go, I don't get it. I've got a paddle that says USA Pickleball approved. How is it illegal? That doesn't make any sense. How can this be? Or I've got a paddle that I'm being told is illegal grit, but it says USA Pickleball approved. How can this be? And they don't seem to understand, because in many cases USA Pickleball unfortunately hasn't done a good enough job of educating the market. They don't seem to understand that when a brand sends in 10 paddles for the sake of argument to USA Pickleball for approval, only those 10 paddles are tested. If your Chinese factory has poor quality control and the next 2,000 paddles they send you have illegal grit, you don't even know about it. Because what you do is you just go, okay, sell it to the customer, sell it to the customer. It is possible that in some cases you might deliberately cherry pick illegally gritty paddles, knowing that they say USA Pickleball approved, and attempt to send them to pros. Has that ever happened? I'm sure. Does it happen all the time? Probably not. I would argue that more often than not, the pickleball brands are simply unaware that there are massive, massive tolerance issues in their manufacturing. That happens on the core crushing, that happens on the grit levels. So that if you think about it, then the poor consumers are going, I don't get it. This thing says it's approved, but suddenly it's somehow illegal or delisted. Yeah, guess what? Because it's important to remember, it doesn't matter whether you're UPA or whether you're USAP. The things that they test in the lab, there is no guarantee that the thing you'll be playing with will be exactly the same as the thing they tested in the lab.
Yeah.
Anyway, long
That's
story.
That's a good idea, though, when going back to what you're saying about ping pong. Like, you take the paddles that have been approved and just hold on to them and then hand it to them before the match.
Yeah, you say that, but check it out. So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that this is the paddle that gets tested in the lab, right? But what happens at a tournament, right? Different. Rec play, pro play, different. Let's talk about pro play. What happens at a tournament? Do they run a PB core test and a spin test on location? Nuh-uh, because they can't. Because those tests are done with the hydraulic cannons, and those are done only in the lab.
So what about the testing that's done on site?
It's nothing to do with PB core. It's a deflection test. But guess what? What's a deflection test? They put these two bars like this, roughly, right? 6 inches apart. And they push from the top while there's 2 bars underneath. Guess what happens? It's only testing the deflection of the center section of the paddle. And what happens in a floating core? It's not that bit that floats. It's the outer bit that floats, because that's where the soft, squishy stuff is. So it means that the deflection test that's done on location, which at USA Pickleball is just called a deflection test, whereas UPA renames things because they think it makes them different. They call it ADF, ever so slightly different, basically measuring the same thing. Those 2 tests are irrelevant for floating core paddles, completely irrelevant. So the bottom line is that if a paddle that has a floating core, which many modern powerful paddles that are popular have, if those paddles pass PB core, you cannot tell at all whether or not they're hot if you're testing them with a deflection test on the day. So if you think about that recent scenario that happened where Liz, I forget what her last name is, Liz Truck, what's her name? Fuck, I've forgotten. The challenge, I don't know if you read the article, the other day there was, Travis Rettenmeyer did the first ever challenge in a PPA tournament under modern rules. And it was on a Yola paddle, and it was deemed to be illegal. And they lost. They won the challenge, so the other team was fined $2,500 and had all their points deducted. But it took them a week to do that challenge. Why did it take a week? Because it had to go back to the lab to get tested under PB core, because they know full well that the deflection test is nonsense. So that is a typical example of something that a manufacturer-led group would fix, because you do not do deflection tests like this. You do so-called edge-to-edge deflection. You need to test deflection from the one edge to the paddle to the other edge of the paddle, not an arbitrarily constrained 6 inches. The only reason why floating core paddles exist is because of the poorly framed deflection test. Too much nerdy information.
That's super nerdy.
Yeah,
but I appreciate it.
All right. Is there anything that we missed that you feel like you want to address? I feel like I ended up talking quite a lot about the UPA USAP stuff, which is fine because it's important, but it's not so much about Reload. But it's okay because it's.
I enjoyed that. No, I appreciate it. Actually, I guess you could look at something. I don't know. I am not as familiar with licensing technology or an IP to brands. But I guess if we're on the subject of like, if you have something that is, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, how are you going to work out licensing, or how do people work out licensing so that it is fair isn't the right word, but do you know what I mean?
No, I understand what you mean.
Not that you would be that person, but hypothetically speaking, someone might.
So the way licensing would work for Reload is, it's relatively straightforward. I mean, at the end of the day, in business, what you have is everybody has a product, and the product is made for a certain price and then sold for hopefully a higher price. Because if you're in the business of selling products for less than it costs you to make them, you're not in business. You're a charity. So that means that if you think about it, I know exactly how much it costs me to make this, and I know how much I think it's reasonable to try to sell it for, considering that what we're trying to do is, think about the equivalent. The equivalent is that instead of buying a $250 paddle, you can just buy, for the sake of argument, a 2-pack of Reload sheets and reload your paddle. So, but what are the constraints on how much I'm paying for this? Well, all supply chain aspects that you can think of. For example, how many are you ordering? Is there any way to make this thing more efficient? Can you use cheaper materials without compromising the quality of your brand and or the customer experience? But here's the thing that's interesting. When you license, so there are 2 different ways in which one licenses a product like this. Number one is the most obvious one is you make it for other people. So for example, somebody licenses it and they would go, okay, hey, we want like an initial order, we want like 250,000 of these things, but it's for our paddle shape, which we collaborate on to work together, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So remember, I know how much it costs me to make them, and I know how much I can try and sell them for. So instead of me selling them, someone else would sell them as part of their product under their brand. But the license means there's a little bit of extra money that one would make on top of that. So just like any kind of a deal like that, you're always going to make more money selling them direct per each unit. But you don't do these deals, just like when you think about any other aspect of business deals, you don't do a licensing deal in order to make more money on a single sale. You do it because of the fact that the synergy in that relationship is that one company is able to have way more marketing footprint, and they see value, even though they're going to pay a little bit extra for it, they see value in that. So it's a horse trade of one versus the other. In short, if you imagine, rather than being specific about numbers for, say, something like Reload, let's do something even more inane, like, for example, overgrip. So you would never license overgrip because it's a generic product, but let's pretend someone made a special kind of overgrip. From a factory, it might cost, I don't know, 30 cents for an overgrip, maybe even less, depending on how customized it is. So imagine if you really wanted to, as a brand, include that overgrip in your product, you cannot go to the factory and just say, hey, here's 30 cents each, make us a bunch of overgrips. You're not allowed to because you have to license. So instead what you would do is you would go, we'll pay 40 cents. And the 10 cents is the license fee. But it's up to you whether or not you want to charge a little bit extra for the product because it has that thing, or whether you just want to go, well, that's cool. We've just got a new product line. It happens to contain this cool licensed thing. So technology transfer and the right to do something is separate from pricing. But from the perspective of how that works, I mean, another common product in sports is, say, BOA. BOA, I don't know if you know what BOA shoelacing is. It exists on some high-end bike shoes and high-end snowboard boots. It's one of these systems where instead of using laces, you twist a wheel and it ratchets the shoe closed. So that is a licensable piece of IP. So it means that when a company, for example, Salomon, licenses a BOA shoelace system, they, number one, can purchase those things from BOA. They can use that in their marketing in some ways. But it's the relationship works both ways, because it's great for BOA because they sell a lot of things, but also it validates that BOA is a cool thing because Salomon is now using it. So whichever pickleball paddle brand we end up licensing to, or it could easily be multiple ones if it goes along how it's going now, that's the way it works, is that they will benefit from the fact that their customers will go, oh shit, that's awesome. Now I don't have to keep buying the same paddle over and over again. They'll retain their customers longer. And we benefit from the fact that, sure, there's a little bit of a license fee, but in the long run, it also validates certain aspects of the business. Does that make sense overall?
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess what I'm asking is how is it made sure that the license, the company with the technology that's being licensed can't, I guess, like, is price gouge used in the right context?
I think I understand what you're
taking advantage.
I think I understand what you're saying. So you're saying
because this is kind of new, right?
Yeah,
not just this concept, but like what else is being licensed in pickleball right now?
So yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm
just not familiar with that.
No, I think there's very little from a technical perspective that's being licensed. I would take a guess that SwiftNet is being licensed. The only reason I would say that is I believe there's a range of Yola nets that use a multi-section carbon fiber tube. Do you know what I mean by SwiftNet?
Yeah.
You know how they have that curved thing that goes under tension and holds the net in place? I love those nets. I use them. But
Genius.
Considering, I forget what the Yola model number of the net is that has the exact same system, but I would be surprised if that wasn't made under license. I don't know for sure. It just looks very, very similar. But licensing IP is obviously an interesting thing because in most instances, companies would prefer to develop their own or have some, or let's say work around the IP if it's possible. But that's not always the case. In some cases, people see the synergy, and if they see the synergy, and this is many of the discussions that we're having, then one constructs a deal that's mutually beneficial to both entities. If you're asking about gouging, or whether you call it patent trolling, or it doesn't matter, some version of that. In other words, if you're saying what prevents a company from going, well, you got to pay me $50 per paddle.
Yeah.
The answer is nothing. Nothing prevents that, except for the obvious thing, which is they won't do that deal. So for the sake of argument, a company that I'm talking to, if I go, hey, listen, yeah, this is awesome. I really want to work with you, but it's $50 per paddle. They'll just be like, first of all, they'll laugh, and then they'll never speak to me again, because it would be ridiculous to do that, because of the fact that then that I might as well not start the conversation to begin with. And it doesn't matter whether it's Reload or whether it's a new kind of, I don't know, zip for bags and somebody wants to do a deal. They'll just do something else. And in this case, it's quite clear what the something else is. The something else is a regular paddle. So it's absolutely in my interest and in any IP holder's interest to do one of two things. Either not licensed to anybody, so you go, hey, this is just mine, and I'm going to push down the path of developing an ecosystem around it. Or to license to select individuals if you can figure out some kind of a synergy where it's beneficial for them and it's beneficial for you, and obviously ultimately beneficial for the customer.
Nice.
Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
So nothing prevents aggressive deal making, other than if it's too aggressive, there's no deal.
Yeah. What's next for Reload? Like you mentioned how you guys are looking at different surfaces that have different outputs, which is sweet. I remember someone kept asking, I think in the comment section of Chris's video, was like, when are we getting new or different shapes?
So let's see. It's been a lot of work over the last 6 months since launch, trying to deal with all the inbound interest and identifying what the best path is going forward. And I can give you the short-term answer. The longer-term answer exists, but I don't want to talk about it in detail yet. In the short-term answer, first of all, a 14 millimeter has already been submitted. Second of all, a wide body shape. I don't want to do 4 different shapes. I know that it feels at times, they're like, yeah, people want it because that's what they're used to. But honestly, I've had a lot of people say stuff like, hey, why don't you make an elongated shape? And I'm like, it is an elongated shape. Well, it's more like a hybrid. And I'm like, really, is it? It feels like from a measurement that it's kind of a hybrid and an elongated. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that, a 1/4 inch extra of curve on the... I'm like, really? Is that the difference? So what I'm trying to say is that I don't know. I mean, at some point, resisting market standards and expectations is a bit like tilting at windmills. You have to bend to the whim of the market. If the market wants 3 different shapes, eventually the market will get 3 different shapes. But as a startup, you have to pick your battles, and you have to decide what's the most important thing here. So if I looked at Reload longer term, the paddle base is much less important than the sheet. The sheet is where the core of the IP is, and that's where the core of the engineering R&D focus has been. So you touched on that. There are 3 different sheet types that have been, well, there are about 10 or 15 different ones that we've been experimenting with, but 3 have been down selected for further R&D and fine tuning. That's coming, I would say, relatively soon, so 3 to 6 months. So the 14 millimeter paddle base will come out soon. That'll use the exact same sheets, which is kind of the point. And wide body shortly thereafter, which obviously will be different sheets because they're slightly different shape. And then expect to see a license deal announcement in the next 3 to 6 months also. There's some very, very interesting high profile, I don't want to call it a license, but let's just say high profile marketing endeavors, which you will also be hearing about. There's lots of other little things, accessories, some of which you've already seen, a bag, t-shirts, hats. The main thing for me is that I don't want to make generic products. So if I'm going to make a product, I want it to be different, but not different for the sake of being different. I want it to be meaningfully different. And as an entrepreneur, I have to be very careful about that, because there are some things that are fascinating to play with, but they're not the best use of time. For example, hey, let's go and make a paddle bag. I think a lot of paddle bags out there are kind of crappy, but while I can certainly sit there and pontificate on how to make a cool bag, there are other companies whose core focus is specifically bags. So I don't like the idea of staying in a lane, because part of the beauty of entrepreneurship and inventing and all aspects of creation is that you get to play in different lanes and draw influence from different lanes. But in this particular case, it's important to stay focused on a key thing, which is not just the fact that this is a replaceable element, but also what else can we bring to paddle performance and touch with this replaceable element.
Yeah.
For example, you touched on, there's multiple different sheets. Think about what this means. It's a modular system. It's not just the idea that you could go, here's a paddle base, and you can just toss it out when it wears out. You can decide, for the sake of argument, this might be, we need higher grit for whatever condition. We need higher power for whatever condition. I like to use the high grit sheets on the wide body, but on the wide body 14, but on the 16 millimeter paddle, which is a little softer, I prefer the power sheets because I want that extra punch. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about doing. And yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to get right.
Yeah. That was interesting when you're talking about the joy of, I suppose the joy of entrepreneurship is the ability to explore different things. Because you don't want to be like, just stay in my lane. I do think, and then it's funny because what came up was like, Reload's not a convenience store, right? There are some brands who they don't make anything particularly profound or innovative. They just put out products. It's like, cool. Well, you can go ahead and put out grips out. You can put out bags. You can put out merch, whatever. But it does make sense that you're focusing, like, keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing is the fact that it is a modular system. And then you just make, like, you just keep enhancing, or you're offering like different, you're exploring different features or traits that could be still using the same foundational principle of keeping it modular and the face sheet. So yeah, that's awesome to hear. Yeah. Like, damn, that's cool.
I mean, look, I'll say one more thing, which I think is fascinating, and it's taking up a lot of my time thinking about international expansion, because we touched on the price point, but there is another way of thinking about the price point, which I think is important to consider. I think we might have talked about this briefly before, but maybe that was by email. And it's this. If you think about cars, so everyone has a sense. You don't have to do complicated math. If I tell you, hey, listen, this truck is amazing, but it goes 8 miles per gallon, whereas this hybrid is also kind of amazing, and it does 42 miles per gallon. And if I say, hey, quick, how many dollars per mile is that? You'll be like, no, but you don't need to do that precise math. It's possible. With a few minutes and a little bit of Google search, you can find out the answer to this question, or one ChatGPT query. But you don't have to know the right answer. You can feel the right answer, because you know that it's going to cost you a lot more to drive around in an 8 miles per gallon truck or passenger van than it is to drive around in a 42 miles per gallon hybrid. They're obviously not the same vehicle. If you really need to transport heavy things, you'll need the truck. But the point is, the dollar cost you can feel. In pickleball, that doesn't exist yet. And it doesn't exist yet because people don't, for the reasons we discussed before, people don't always think about how long does my equipment last? How soon can I feel that it's wearing out? How fast do I need to replace it? How much is that going to cost? But it's possible to think about it. So let's apply some average numbers here. Let's not talk about the extremely expensive paddles or the extremely cheap ones or how long exactly everything takes, but I'll give you some averages. A $200 paddle where the surface grit lasts on average 50 hours, which we talked about already and we have the data for, that's $4 per hour. That's how much it costs to play pickleball if you're playing with a premium piece of equipment. Now, there are definitely some people who don't care, because they'll be like, $4 per hour, I don't care, I'll just buy another one. But internationally, $4 per hour is a lot for an activity we're trying to grow. Multiple people have stated that the single biggest impediment they see to the growth of pickleball worldwide is the cost of the equipment, which is weird, right? Because the equipment doesn't last that long. That's the problem. So today, we can do $1 per hour with the current price of these 2-packs. These prices are going to go down. They're going to go down because of scale. They're going to go down because we're going to have clever ways to work around the supply chain. My point is that I believe that the only way to bring the utilization cost of pickleball, the cost of playing pickleball down to like 50 cents per hour or 25 cents per hour is by using replaceable elements. And that is something that I think about a lot, is how do you structure, you talked about the financing structure of the licensing deals, or you asked about that. How do you finance a licensing deal so that you can do exactly this kind of thing? Because I think it would be a massive part of helping pickleball grow worldwide. And that's the thing if you want a higher level question as to what I think about is next, yeah, sure, I can answer the consumer question of, we're going to do a different shape, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. No, what I really want to think about is we're going to alter the way pickleball equipment is consumed and used, and ultimately change the way in which the sport grows. That's the plan.
And there is certainly truth to that, because something that just came up is there's communities in Uganda that have been playing pickleball. They're interested in it, they love it, and they play it a lot. And this is a great example because they have they're charged like a postage fee. If you ship something to them, it costs them money depending on the size of the package. Really? Yeah.
Oh, like the recipient pays?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So they were, I forgot what it was exactly. I don't know if it was like, it wasn't insurance. It may have been something like that. But I was telling them, I was like, hey, if I wanted to ship you guys paddles, what would it cost? So there's like a few things in here, but one thing is like they're like, hey, just write down that the weight of the package or like the cost of the package is like X. Yeah. It's like, imagine how much more you could send of this versus a ton of paddles that also have like a higher weight cost. And also like you see them with a bunch of really old paddles, and then there's like some like newer ones. It's like, imagine if you just were able to be like, hey, we're going to send you these face sheets, and then you could play a lot longer. But like, yeah, I think they're just like, they're breaking some, and they're breaking just like the paddles and stuff like that. Or like, obviously some of those paddles are really old that they're like, they're not even secondhand that people are sending. They're just sending them like junk almost. But this is like one look at a solution.
Yeah. It's interesting. It alters so many aspects of the way in which we think about the consumption of the product. Because look, we talked about the cost of a paddle is like $25 or $30 at worst to make. In the grand scheme of things, that cost of the paddle is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It should be zero. Like if we construct this correctly, we should be able to construct a model in which, let's say for the sake of argument, I know the subscription model is a dirty word, but it is essentially that. But imagine if instead of buying a $250 paddle every 4 weeks or 6 weeks, you paid $25 a month. And not only would you get a fresh paddle every month, but on top of that, if ever there was a new core that was developed, it doesn't matter, Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5, Gen 9, whatever we're on, how much would you pay for that? Zero. You would just get it. You would get it as an automatic upgrade. And that's a future. Well, that's what I think the future looks like, is that if you get people used to the idea that they're constantly swapping the outside surface, the competitive advantage you get from that as a company is that you can, it's not that the core upgrades won't exist. They absolutely will. It's just that it's something that the community you'll end up building. And I don't mean that in the kind of everybody's happy version of community. I'm talking about the brand version of the community, the fact that people will end up using and loving your products because it's rewarding them in a way that they go, okay, you're not punishing them that, oh, the paddle wears out, oh, now I have to buy another one. It's the paddle wears out, oh, I just get another one. Because you don't need to charge them for the core of the paddle if you're actually making sufficient amounts of money from the fact that they're refreshing the surface all the time. Does that make some sense? In other words, then it ends up being not just the three things I'm talking about now, which is better performance, better value, and better for the environment, but it's also future-proofed. Because how cool would it be? Imagine, how often do the shapes of the paddles change? Not that often. Consider Yola. Yola has had the Hyperion shape since the Gen 1. Imagine if you were a Gen 1 customer of Yola, and instead of having to buy a Hyperion Gen 2 and then a Gen 3 and then a Gen 3S and now a Pro 4, imagine if all you got was, you're like, oh, you can keep reusing the same sheets and you just swap the core. And in fact, you know what? You've been a good customer of ours. Here's a core for free. You don't need, and in fact, oh, you broke the core. Here's another one for free. You don't need to constantly be making money on the core when the thing wears out. And that is the thing that scares the shit out of other paddle companies, because their entire model is based around, let's sell as many of these cores as possible, as frequently as possible. The idea here isn't that you cannot make money this way. The idea is, and I told you about this before, stop thinking about the consumer as something that you have to milk as much as possible and your one chance you get to sell to them before they go and buy from somebody else. Think about it as a lifetime value thing, because if you can do that, you please them more and you end up making more money in the long run, not to mention the fact that it's better for the sport and better for the planet.
Yeah.
Here we go. We'll see. So either I win big or I get killed. We'll see. It's kind of binary.
I feel like if you get killed, then someone else is going to take this and they're going to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I say this with a smile on my face because I think the odds on it are very small. I've been involved in a number of different startups, consumer mobile apps, film, storytelling, VR, AR. I have gone through a number of different rounds of fundraising, angel investors, seed stage, small VCs, big VCs, strategic partners that are investing off balance sheet. And I have never come across something that when I talk about it, not only I always try to be as genuine as possible, but ultimately when you're pitching investors or partners, there's an element of performance in that because it's a pitch after all. You're trying to spin positive things. But I have never been as effortlessly genuine as when I'm talking about the benefits of this, because it seems so many boxes are ticked from the branding to the performance value, sustainability aspect of things. So it's been exciting talking to investors and partners about what's going to happen next, and I look forward to sharing it with you and with everyone who's listening to this.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. I feel like that's a good point to wrap up on. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you want to talk about?
I've probably talked about way too many things, so I'm just going to go with a no. So,
all right. Yeah, I feel very fulfilled as far as how this conversation went. Cool. Obviously, there's tons of questions here and all this stuff, but you touched on a lot of things that I didn't expect. So yeah, man, appreciate you taking the time.
So do I. It's good. We didn't talk about. I just realized we didn't talk about the filmmaking side, but it's all right. We kind of touched on it very briefly.
We can save that.
It would seem a little weird if we talk about too many things, because then people have a habit of going like, wait, what? What? Why does he do all this stuff? I don't know. Just, he likes it.
Yeah.
So I gotta go pee, but let me text Dominique just to tell her. All right. You all right to come out for some food? All those costs combined together averaged out for a single paddle. So roughly $25 is what a paddle costs. But if you're selling this thing for $250, it's good business to just keep selling it over and over and over again.
What'd you think of the interview? It was a long one. I was thinking about a lot during the interview, and I just had a bunch of thoughts, and it was also a lot of information coming in at me at that time. So I wasn't able to ask the questions that I wanted to ask, and I wasn't able to say the things that I wanted to say either. So I figured the best way to do that would be to just do this post-interview reaction and thoughts. So I wrote down some of my thoughts, and one of the things that people have been asking me ever since the interview, but also when we demoed the paddles at a local facility called Eastside Paddle Club, is that people were skeptical about the performance of the paddle. There's been three of the primary reviewers who have already talked about the performance of the paddle, which is Pickleball Studio, John Q, and Braden from Pickleball Effect. I had to play with it for myself to get a feeling and understanding of the paddle, and just so everyone is clear and everyone is aware, these are Gen 2 paddles. This plays just like a Gen 2 paddle. This isn't like a gimmick. It's not like, oh, we have a replaceable surface grit, so it must play like crap. That's just not the case. It's a regular Gen 2 paddle. I will say, as far as what I felt about the paddle, it gets a lot of absorption, or some people call it dwell time. So you can really feel the ball sitting on the paddle face. So I would say it's pretty soft, but it also has good pop. I would say it's not a firm paddle by any means. So yeah, you can really feel the dwell time on these paddles. Yeah, feels good. I think in the reviews, they said the swing weight is a little high. Something else that's worth noting is that I don't believe that this has to be a choice. It's not like, okay, it's Reload or nothing. The way that this is going to go is that both are going to exist, and the technology is going to be licensed, and brands are going to keep doing the same thing that they're doing with the different technologies that they're doing, the different things that they're innovating on, which is mostly with the core. There are notable brands and employees working hard to push core technologies, and in addition to that, they can also include replaceable surfaces. I'm not entirely convinced that most non-pro consumers switch paddles or buy new paddles because of the grit surface. I mean, it definitely wears down, but I think it's more about the technology that's introduced, like the power or different cores. So I think that is actually the primary reason why non-pro consumers do it. We all know by now that all the pros, they switch paddles sometimes after every match, maybe even after every game, but they switch paddles very frequently because of the surface grit. And then that makes you kind of wonder about that side of things as far as the technology. We've gone from Gen 1 to Gen 2 to Gen 3, and some brands have gone back to Gen 1. Are these incremental enhancements, upgrades, or technologies really necessary? Are they as impactful as we think? How impactful is shape? How impactful is a new surface, a new core? How impactful is a new face sheet for rec players? Nick is going to be speaking at racquetx, and he mentions it in the podcast, but he's going to be speaking with a few of the heads of those paddle brands like Gearbox, Yola, Selkirk. Carl Schmitz from USAP will be there, and they're going to be having a discussion about governance, so that's going to be really interesting. I am curious to hear what people think if having multiple regulatory bodies is maybe not that whether it's good or bad, or what the effect it has on a sport and the consumer side of things. And if you're not favoring multiple governing bodies, then what do you think would be the optimal solution there? I'm just not really sure about regulations in other sports. In the UFC, there was one governing body, but then each state had their own regulations as well. But as far as drugs and doping and testing, that was always done by USADA, USA Doping Agency. Same agency that did the Olympics, which doesn't say much because they obviously didn't do a great job at that either. Another thought I wanted to share about Reload. I think it's going to be really interesting when these become more and more modular, right? Right now, we know we can add tape, but it's not something that comes with the product, with the exception of the metal bone, which it's not done great. Imagine the way Nick was talking about it, that these surface grits can have different levels of grit. They can also cause different effects. Imagine if maybe one day you can have replaceable cores. Maybe you don't have to buy the weighted caps from third parties, and they just end up coming with it, and you can take it out or keep it in there. There's definitely more aesthetic customizations we can make than the performance enhancements. Anyways, thanks for watching.